Hey everybody, it's Georgia Weedman, author of Penetration Testing, a hands-on introduction to hacking, and your instructor for this accompanying lab. So this time we're going to look at something a little bit different. If we open up our lab, we don't actually end up on Kali this time. We go straight to just a web interface for something called Blue Fox CMS. And it's very nice. It says, change the admin password. The default admin user is installed by default. I said default twice. With password admin, it is strongly recommended you change that password. This is not good security. Things like, this was a problem with Apache Tomcat for a long time, that it would be like Tomcat or Tomcat Secret, and it would, unless somebody bothered to change it, which one, they have to know it's there. Two, they have to have, the security savvy to know they're supposed to change it. A lot of these passwords would stay default. Tomcat's not the only one that had this problem. I mentioned in a previous video, like XAMPP, LAMP, WAMP, those kinds of things had a tendency to do it too on some of their admin interfaces. But it's always nice when they just say right here on the page, hey, we don't even have to go look up the user manual. User manuals are great. You can find stuff like this. It's always been I did a cyber defense competition once where I was on the red team, and the power supplies were actually online, so they were in play. And I zoomed in a little bit on my camera to get the model number because they were over there, and I looked up the model number, and it said that the default admin password was 1234. Since it was a cyber defense competition, naturally they had not changed it. None of the teams had gotten around to changing it either. Probably didn't even know it was on the network, that it was actually valid. So I was able to log into the web interface of all of them and actually cut the power to their entire network, and it made the students very unhappy. So this stuff definitely happens, and yeah, certainly IoT devices and things like that, make it even worse. But, you should always try the defaults. What do you have to lose? So admin. Sure enough, that grabs me in as a administrator, and then I can probably go to Admin Center would be a good place to go. It gives me the version of Blue Fox CMS. So how nice of it. It says it's strongly recommended to change the admin's password. Well, thanks. Well, they didn't. Oops. So, we would Google the vulnerability. You can look at these, and it actually has local file inclusion in the file URL parameter. So, there's actually a couple of ways you can get to this. This is what local file inclusion is, and we will definitely, talk about that when we get down to the third-party web apps. We'll look at it a bit more. Right now we're really just focusing on known vulnerabilities in third-party web apps that you're likely to see at multiple locations, things that a lot of people need, wikis, timesheet stuff, website builders, content management, all that sort of stuff. You're likely to see it a lot of times, and unlike when we do our third-party web application stuff where it's custom, you're trying to find vulnerabilities in somebody's custom app. With these, just like network vulnerabilities, we already have databases out there of known vulnerabilities that we may be able to kind of piggyback on what somebody else has already done. So to deal with local file inclusion, right? Okay, so basically things should, from the web server, it should only be able to serve web pages that are on the web server in the directories that are meant to be serving web pages. In some of our previous examples, we actually wrote files, like we used MSF Venom, or we did a really simple SQL example where we would write a file that was basically a backdoor onto the web server, and then we were able to, through the browser, go to it and execute that page, and then we were able to run stuff. But that was all coming from, we were only able to do that because we were able to write to the web server through various means. But what should not happen in a properly configured web server is that the web server will show pages that are on the underlying system, or even like the configuration files for Apache or what have you, anything that has, sensitive information that, the people who are able to see this should not see, that should not serve. It should not be allowed to be shown. But if that does happen, and it does happen from time to time, it's even got its own, class of vulnerability name. That's local file inclusion. So that's being able to get access to files that you shouldn't, basically, through a web server. Being able to, traverse out of the web server directory that it's supposed to be serving from and show files that it shouldn't. So, we can fool around with this. It looks like it's got PHP myadmin, but, we already did that on a different example. Actually, like I said, there's a couple of different ways to get to this. You can read through the exploit database or whatnot, but I think this one is very classy. I guess since the file that we're after, we should actually probably read it. Objective: exploit the web application and retrieve the flag from the etc password file. So it actually turns out for things like this, you've typically got something where you can, edit pages and whatnot. So if we go to templates, that's exactly what that is. So open up the default template. So it actually will show us the source code of the file because, you can edit it. That totally makes sense. One thing to keep in mind, here's like the file here. So you see at the beginning, it says ... and then templates default .html. That ... that means go back a directory. You can do this at the command line too. If you want to go back one directory and then you want to move out of whatever your directory is, go to the one before it and then move forward again on that. You can use a ... That's just when they were making this stuff up. I wasn't in the room. I may not have been born yet, but especially when we get into to buffer overflow stuff, there will definitely be things where I'm like, I really wish I was there and I could ask the people who were doing this why they thought this was a good idea, like why the stack should be upside down, for instance. But that's another story for another video. Well, probably the answer is because nobody was thinking about security at the time, but that's kind of depressing. But anyway, if we actually look at the URL, and that I'm going to have to take out. If we look at the URL, and that's really awful because those are all like clients I didn't delete out of here. So I'm just gonna have to kill that, clearly. Luckily I can do that in the post-production, but it's really annoying. But anyway, so file URL equals templates default HTML. So that's actually the file that it's grabbing, and except it's going back a directory, so it looks like it goes back a directory. It goes into templates default HTML. So the question would be, so if I can just call the file from the URL, can I then call the file any file that I want, basically? Can I get out of the web server directory and get that to show me code of underlying files? It says to get etc password. So, that might be what I would do. So, if I just do like etc password, and that's password without an O or an R. Another thing I was not there to make the decision for, it comes out as, well, it double slashed at the beginning, so that's no good, but it's just a ... etc password. But we want to get all the way to the root because etc password is at root etc password. So, we're not entirely sure where we are on the file system. I mentioned in a previous video, usually by default, it's var www HTML. So since there's already one ... my guess would be, so if we want to get out of HTML, get out of www, get out of var, we would need to drop back 3 directories. It looks like we're already dropping back 1. So what if we drop back just 2 up here? And that looks like we did it. So, you look up here. So we've dropped back 3 directories. So that drops us out of HTML, out of www, and out of var. Takes us to the root. We go to etc, we go to password. Notice there are no passwords in here. Actually, in Linux, the passwords are in a file called etc shadow, but that's where it told us to get, and that's where it hid the flag. So that should be our flag. So main problems here: default admin password. It was actually nice enough to even tell us what the admin default password was. So that's helpful. And it did have a known vulnerability, based on just the the version number that it gave us. It does have a known vulnerability for local file inclusion that we were able to use. I mean, it gave us this really nice interface here where we could view the contents of files for the purpose of editing, because it allowed us to do the directory traversal, get out of where we needed to be and onto the regular file system. We were able to load up files that we definitely, just as a regular web user, even as an administrative user of the web application, we don't really have any business seeing the underlying system. So, this is bad, and people should definitely not have problems like this in their web applications, but they do. So, all right, that's all for this one. Let me get all my client names out of this video, and then I will reset Firefox so it doesn't happen again. So, adventures in security failures. See you guys next time.